Final Fantasy XIV needs better mid-core content. Hello Void, I'm Eldon, and I like playing 14. I don't really love Savage, and I don't really love Dungeons, but I like 14. What I yearn for, what I crave, is true, honest mid-core. I want a mid-core experience, and sadly, 14 doesn't really have that right now. It has long been known that 14 lacks something between normal mode content and harder, extremes, and savage. So let's look at that. Does 14 actually have no mid-core content? Is there a secret mid-core? Are people just fond of complaining? Before we do, though, a quick aside. Please subscribe if you enjoy these videos. We're making them every week. We're talking about 14 most of the time. So subscribe, it helps us out a lot, and I enjoy seeing the number go up. So, the actual problem with this discussion, and the first thing we're going to address, is something very simple. There is no definition of mid-core. When engaging in the mid-core debate, there is a fundamental mismatch between different people who are having the discussion. They cannot agree on what this term actually means. We know it's somewhere between dungeons and all the other really easy content, and the upper end of things like Savage and Ultimate. But where the actual start of midcore begins and where it ends is really up in the air and gets decided on a per-person basis depending on what they want to argue in that moment. Therefore, the only way to have this video be coherent is to come up with a definitive answer for what midcore actually means. That way we can address the more important questions. And after a great deal of thought, I think I've come to a definition. Midcore is any content where you can learn the fight in one instance, but are expected to wipe at least a few times. I think there are two key aspects to this definition. The first is learning the fight. In 14, there are two types of fights. There are some fights where you can go in blind and it's fine, and there are some fights where if you don't know what's going on, you're going to get kicked from the instance. Now, of course, there are some special exceptions like PF blind parties, but those dissolve in like an hour when one person has to leave, so we're not gonna worry about those for the purpose of this video. For the most part, these two different types of fights have a strict divide, which we can see in the game. One is queued for, and for the other, you use PF. If you are going into Party Finder, you are expected to know how the fight works and what you are supposed to be doing. And that expectation is realistically, that expectation is the only reasonable way you can have a hope of clearing in one instance. Even for the lowest end of PF content extreme, they're probably going to take at least 2 or 3 instances with different groups to get through everything. If the expectation for mid-core content under our definition is that you're able to learn the fight within the instance, then that would leave us with the type of content that you can queue for. And certainly there's plenty of content that you can queue for. However, this brings us to the second important part of the definition. You should be expected in mid-core content to wipe at least a few times. If you have 60 minutes on an instance timer, then you should be expected to spend at least 30 minutes of that trying to clear. Simple content can be stumbled through. You can just wipe your way through even the hardest of normal raids. You might wipe once or twice, especially week 1, if the healers mess up, but realistically, that's not mid-core. If you want something that's truly mid-core, then you should be dying. You should feel threatened. The reason you want people to feel threatened is because that's the only way you're going to push them to learn their jobs. There's a very common misconception I think the community has in 14, which is that this is a hard game. It's not. It's an easy game. The issue is not that it is hard. The issue is that there's nothing that will get people to learn their jobs before you get into like extreme. There is no reason to learn how to play the game. And so we need mid-core. We need content that can act as that ramp, as the middle ground between easy and difficult. That way people will be forced to learn how to play their job. They will be forced to learn how to use the abilities correctly and will eventually be better. What we're left with is something that you can queue for, but something that is dangerous. And sadly, that doesn't really exist in 14 at the moment. Or does it? I will say, dear viewer, that there is a reason I chose this definition for midcore, and that is because there is one piece of content in 14 right now that I think perfectly fits my vision for what midcore content ought to be. And that content is ARR Extreme Trials. I don't know if you've ever been in Mentor Roulette, but I've done my fair share. Been around the block a time or two, and when you get into an ARR Extreme Trial, it is fun and interesting. You hop in, and there's going to be like 3 to 5 people that don't know what's going on. This is their first time queuing for anything past a Castrum Meridianum. But you don't have to spend 20 minutes explaining what's going on. No one's going to do that. You're just going to give them a basic rundown of the top to bottom things they can expect, and then you're going to get straight into pulls. You're going to wipe a time or two. Someone's going to mess something up, but most of the time, you'll learn, take a few wipes on the chin, and eventually you'll clear, having felt like you've actually achieved something within a short amount of time. Well, that is if the mentors don't leave because they're trying to spam for a stupid achievement. Going through Titan Extreme is one of the most fun things I've ever done as a Sprout. It was my first peek at what 14 could be. And I think that is the purpose of midcore, to give people a taste of the heights this game can reach, and to bring them up to speed on the kind of things this game expects. ARR Extreme Trials, because the way the scaling works out, don't always kill you when you mess up a mechanic. And the DPS checks are so light that you don't have to worry about rage. They're the perfect balance of difficulty and approachability, and you can get into them through queuing. They're almost the perfect platonic ideal of what midcore can be, except for one thing. You're locked at level 50, and the level 50 kits are anemic, they're empty, and they're not designed. Half of them don't even have the cool thing about the job. And so that's the solution, right? Just scale the ARR extremes up to level 100, and then you'll be good, right? Well, you see, there is one other piece of misdirection I've laid into this video so far, and that is presenting this thing as a binary. ARR extremes are the platonic ideal of midcore, but that's because they lie in the perfect center. This is not a one side or the other type argument. Difficulty is a scale. Some content is bone easy. Other content is incredibly difficult. But let's open up our perception not just to casual or hardcore, to these arbitrary tags. Let's instead look at this as a sliding scale from easiest to hardest. You'll notice a few things right off the bat. One is that most content tends to be stuck at the poles. Some of it towards the easier side, some of it towards the hard. The easier side is clumped up around the massive amount of roulette activities. Dungeons, normal mode raids, the story, all of these things exist in the just try it out section of the graph. That section exists at the lowest end and is the most dense. In between, we have a couple scattered things. No big dense pockets, but we still got interesting stuff like Deep Dungeon and the Exploration Zone that help to fill out the content. These are the types of things you can still queue for, but aren't really a roulette activity. Conversely, at the top end, we also have a lot of very concentrated high difficulty activities. Extremes, Savage, these are your PF classics. The types of activities you'll find parties for all the time, sitting around filling up. This is on content. On the harder end, we also have some newer things like Q40 and Chaotic. But even the PF zone is not nearly so static, and I use that word for a reason, because there is kinda one level beyond PF, and that is content you're expected to do with a static. There are people who PF Ultimate, but most people doing that content are doing it in a set group. Similarly, you probably won't be able to do the final turn through PF because it just expects a little bit more from you. Conversely, if you're going into extremes, you're not really going to need ecstatic. Hell, you may even have a static, but it's probably called something like a playgroup, right? I think the biggest point to look at on this graph is the center point. There is an invisible point right here where you cannot really queue for activities anymore, where you have to go into PF. This point is the biggest hurdle for any new player getting into the game. This is the point where you have to know what you're doing before going into it. And if the game hasn't prepared you before you reach this point, then you're gonna sink or swim. The other thing you can notice is that the distance between the highest density activities is super far. Going straight from roulettes all the way to extreme is a crazy jump. So, what did we learn from looking at this graph? Well, it's important to realize that difficulty, and by extension midcore, is not a single thing. It's a spectrum, it's a slope. It's the ramp up to learning the game, to clearing ultimate. And right now, that slope is missing a lot of steps. Either because they're largely disincentivized, or because they're not part of the way 14 was initially set up. 14 does not have a lot of stuff in the middle of this segment. Roulettes give tomes, Savage gives endgame gear. What is the middle section supposed to give? The midcore content is missing, and it needs to be there. So how are we going to put it back in? Yay! We finally come to the fun part of this video. Now, normally I go into crazy detail about all the different ideas I have and how to implement them, but this time I'm gonna try and keep it short. The point of this is just to have fun. The problem is solidly identified. 14 needs to have more steps from easy content to hard content. It needs to build player skill over time and have different activities that do that. There are some examples that currently exist, but those examples are either uncommon or unincentivized. And now that we know that, I get to make up a bunch of random fun stuff, so let's jump into it. I think the best way to do this is to go up the difficulty slope, so let's start with something just a little bit beyond roulettes. And actually, I think 14 has been doing a decent job of this recently. The newest steep dungeon lets you go up to much higher floors as a starting point, which keeps the higher end floors fairly alive. We also have a new exploration zone, which is certainly getting towards midcore. I mean, it's for grinders, so it's got that going for it. But I think the best way to up the roulettes is not to add more fun new content, but to just make a harder roulette. I think the best thing to do that with would be probably variant. I mean, variant isn't really that hard, to be honest, but I think it definitely deserves to just be in there. Having more varied and more interesting and slightly more difficult roulettes would make the game better. It would start leading people out to the wider edges of 14's content, and that's the kind of content that will help them learn their job as they're expanding past the story. Now, actually, the best way to up the difficulty here is just to fix the level scaling. We're just too strong too quickly. I mean, I get you want to have a decent distinction between gear at Savage and normal, but it completely ruins the rest of the game. You can separate that. You can make it so that you're not terribly overpowered at every single point outside of current content. 14 needs to put some serious time towards making the levels actually feel accurate, that 90% of the game isn't irrelevant by default. That would really up the difficulty variation at these lower levels and force people to pay attention to their jobs. Also, rework the way level scaling works and how job skills are distributed, but that's a conversation for an entirely different time and a rant I cannot get into right now. The next step along the difficulty curve is something that lets people learn their jobs in a harder environment. We could certainly introduce a new difficulty tier between normal and EX, maybe more mechanics, a little bit more damage, but you know, that's kind of uninspired. It's a great option, but it's not the spice we're looking for. Also, the design for AMA content is pretty locked in. I think the best way to incentivize having bigger difficulty is to have a bigger group. We need more high player count duties. I'm not just talking about chaotic, though I do think that chaotic should have been easier than we got in the first round. I think I'd love to be able to do chaotic in queue, but That's not necessarily its niche. What we need is something that you can queue into, that has a ton of people and still requires you to do your job skills. In huge player count content, you can kind of just kill off an alliance because they messed up and it won't really matter. Give me a 48-man raid, not locked behind hours of exploration zone, and give that duty some interesting mechanics. Let it do the near raid thing where it splits every party into a different platform, and then if they mess up, actually wipe them. Add in some mass resurrection mechanics, maybe have a duty action that can raise an entire alliance. And there are mechanics where each alliance has to do or else they specifically will wipe. With a 48-man duty, the party size is way too large to reasonably PF. So having a hard duty that people actually want to play would make queuing into it more likely. And I think it would just be pretty fun. It's the best way to have interesting, difficult content that people actually queue for. Also be fun. It's probably not the best way. It's just fun. I think the last thing 14 needs to add is a way to experience the level of content on par with Savage and Ultimate without having to jump straight into PF. The latter is fine, but the jump from queuing to Party Finder is a bit intense. I think we already have the best solution. Bozja duels. The duels in Bozja were awesome. They let you do a really hard piece of solo content. I think that is an open slot that we haven't filled yet. Have a duels type system similar in theory to the Mass Carnival with a bit more combat focus, and let it use the jobs we're actually going to play in the rest of the game. Each fight would be a difficult challenge on its own, slowly scaling up as it demands harder and harder stuff from you. You could even go all the way up to ultimate level difficulty with its own puzzle mechanics. One of the most interesting things you can do right now as a solo player in 14 is clear out the old Extremes and Savages solo. But the problem with that is that they're not super difficult unless you're doing it just as they become available. Creating an intentional solo environment, a solo focused thing, that would be really fun. I also think the solo focused boss gauntlet is the perfect place to expand on the multiple difficulty options introduced with Q40. We never really talked too much about Q40 in this, but I think that system is probably the best and most likely source of creating good mid-core content in the game. Creating variable difficulty fights, especially solo fights like I'm pitching here, is the best way for people to slowly ramp up their experience level over time. People can work at their own pace from normal raids all the way up to getting practice with Savage and Ultimate level mechanics. It would make going into a larger person raid so much easier, and it would also let people get some reps under their belt before doing the stuff Savage requires. Overall, there's tons of things that could be added to fill midcore. New content ideas mixing old content. Hell, even throw in a new roulette that just lets you run ARR Extreme Trials and it's actually incentivized and you don't have to be a mentor. I don't know, there's so much stuff they can do. But they need to do something. Currently, 14 lacks content between the two extremes of the difficulty slope, and there is no way to climb up to the higher end of content without basically throwing yourself into a sink or swim scenario. Let's throw down the ladder. Let's create a path to the highest heights 14 can reach. And that is the midcore we need. Thank you for watching. I've talked for quite long enough, and now I'd love to hear your ideas. What is the piece of midcore content 14 should add? What piece of midcore content do they already have that I missed? Please leave a comment below and let me know what you think. If you'd like to support me, there is one easy way to do it. I made a video game. It's called Pilgrim Unto Shadow. It's really fun. The demo's out right now, and as of posting this video, our Kickstarter is live. If you have any interest, please check it out. And with all that being said, one last thing to remember. It's a long road out there, Void. So take it easy and stick to the middle path. It'll take you quite far. Bye.